I was recounting with Andrew privately. I realized he had no idea about my story about how my startup co-founder and I kind of like broke up.
Yeah.
And then I was like, well, I'm about to go into this creative project with Andrew, and we've only been friends before. We've never done something like this together. And I was like, I know him. We're friends. Plus, we're working together. I think I'll just try to give him as much of the information as possible, so he knows what's going on. And also, it's important to me. It's like it was a huge part of my life, and I'm still in some ways kind of growing from it, you know.
Yeah.
And he wrote back about like, well, he called me, which I thought was like really lovely, instead of like, you know, my mountain of text. He called me. We had a really nice conversation, but he was like, you should listen to this podcast. And it was like a 2-hour podcast. And I was like, oh man, I don't might want to sign up for a 2-hour podcast. If I started listening to it and I listened to the whole thing, and it was a neurologist talking about memory, and what we were specifically talking about when you jumped on was how they found that we're able to recall different parts of our memory if we shift perspectives of the people involved with that memory. So if we're like able to imagine it from somebody else that was there, all of a sudden we start like remembering different details that otherwise were kind of blocked off to us. And then I practiced that like in real time, imagining, you know, how hard the whole breakup would have been for my co-founder, right? Because in a lot of ways I feel really hurt and feel like I was wronged and all these things were done to me. And then I was like, okay, I'm just going to try to shift perspective. And then some memories started to come up because I was thinking about like, well, let me think about what that would have been like for them. And that's what we were talking about when you jumped on. And I was like, I bet Astrid would find that interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the way, like, what's something that you remembered that you hadn't before?
You know, I think that some of the stuff that I recalled immediately was like meetings that we had about the overall like relationship, and we had like a kind of complicated dynamic because, you know, on one hand I'm working with my dad, which is family business dynamics are always incredibly complicated. So I'm working with my dad on one end, and then I'm working with people I consider like some of my best friends who have traveled all around the world and done so much together. And then there's a big rift between them two, and then I'm kind of trying to jump in and make it all work out and have everybody like each other. And probably the biggest thing I learned that I didn't realize, try to have everybody like me, right? And that was the real thing that was happening there that kind of created some hypocrisy, that created some sense of disloyalty or confusion on what was really true and who was really saying what. And so some of the first stuff that I could start thinking about was actual moments that made me uncomfortable, as far as like, that was something that maybe I was saying to my two co-founders to try to like politically shape the narrative from what my dad had said to make it land softer, but that didn't do them any favors. The real favor would have been had to completely accurately translate where the sentiments were and where the feelings were, without trying to brush it off softly and being worried about what they think about me, right? And so some of those things kind of surface, which is, I think, really important kind of practice. But yeah, it's a good follow-up question, Astrid, as our third co-host of our, like, because that's how all we've done. This is our fourth person that we've talked to, and the thing that we were both saying that we really like so far is that we don't have like a rigid like, okay, lightning question time, Astrid, what city are you from? What do you think the world's going to be like in 10 years? You know, we just had conversations like if we were going to dinner with people. So I guess I'm saying thanks for already jumping in and being like, well, what kind of thing came back? But it was really wild. Memory is itself wild. Not that I know that much, but I know 2 hours more than I knew a week ago, Andrew. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things that's always been fascinating to me. It's coming from the background that I'm in, which has always been in hospitality and in restaurants. It's always been funny to look back on that side of it and go, okay, well, how did this thing come to be? And if you're collaborating with people in a creative process, what were the steps that got you to the final, be it a dish, be it the way that you played it, be it how you do something operationally? And it's always interesting to do what Charlie did, is go back, put yourself in their position and say, okay, how did they get to this dish on this plate, this idea for operations, whatever? And it really helped me open up a different line of understanding and then a different way to be creative in a certain, genre, be it food, be it mixology, be it whatever it was that we were working on at the time. And it was always super interesting to see how how their 1+1 = 2 versus mine. And I think it's a cool question for me to jump into with you is that, Charlie shared your website and I was kind of looking through it, trying to get an understanding of what the conversation was going to be. And I'm not a fan of doing research at all. I like stumbling into things.
Yeah.
But I saw it on there that correct me if I'm wrong, but you were like designing for, I'm assuming, video games, websites, graphic design, anything that's there. In that world, I mean, it's essentially you're coding and then that code translates to something visual.
Mm.
How do you perceive that line item to be the visual representation of what it is that you're coding? If that makes sense is the question, or if I'm even right. And then can you collaborate in that way? Like, is there collaboration that lives, that exists, or has breath inside of that?
Do you mind if I ask a follow-up question? Because I could go any number of the directions of this, and I'm curious what's the thing that's most alive for you in this current moment. Is the thing that you're most interested in the how I collaborate with other people in what I do, or is it how I understand my role in the universe that is visual media?
I think the role in the universe with visual media, because I think that to me is where I think the bigger, more open-ended conversation lies, as opposed to the more micro. I like the macro look at it, but whichever one you feel comfortable answering. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm excited
awesome.
to hear both.
So basically, I consider storytelling my life's work, and I am awful at it, and I am continually trying to improve. And storytelling in some form of media has been like the focus of where I've tried to develop my skill set intentionally. Um, and so historically, I had kind of a background in audio, and that moved to visual stuff only in the last like 6 years, but really intentionally spent a like 3 year time period of going back to school, learning animation, spending a lot of time focused on building up my programming expertise, and then throwing myself into the niche that is building visual tools for artists. And the place that I've ended up in now is that's exactly what I'm doing. Is I make tools that take away all of the higher level abstractions and maths that if somebody on Frozen, for example, wanted to make a snowstorm and they wanted every snowflake to be visually distinct, but have a consistent style along it, they could plug in a bunch of numbers and push a button and generate a whole flurry of snowflakes. And then they could tweak them and get a different output procedurally without having to know all of the stuff that's going on to that, but having like the things broken down for them. And basically the way I think of my role is my job is to give more options for artists to make choices and to save them time so that they can be focused on making more artistic decisions rather than learning the technical aspects of a thing that like gets them out of the creative mode.
So
Oh.
yeah, that's incredible. So what I'm hearing you say is you like to facilitate the creativity,
That's
or
right.
you like to be a part of the creativity, or both?
I like to facilitate the creativity. Yes.
Did that like happen naturally, or is that something that you stumbled into?
Uh,
Because for me, it's like this. The always creativity's always sort of like that, been like that underlining gas tank that I've
mm,
had. But I don't know that I've ever taken a step back and go, well, who actually created the steps for me to be creative, or who
yeah.
built tools that I can use in my creativity? And I don't know that I've ever put those two things together. So I'm very interested in exactly that and how that kind of came about.
Yeah, it came about wholly organically because I was started in school trying to do specific things, and in trying to code a specific series of things, found myself going, "Wow, I wish I had the ability to just see this as I'm doing it rather than coding it." And so then I made a tool that showed me the thing that I was building as I was building it, so I could make the artistic judgments and see the changes in real time rather than changing numbers in a spreadsheet or changing numbers in a block of code, and then waiting for a generation step to happen that would take like a couple of minutes, or waiting for the code to compile, and then getting an output of just saying like, here's my inputs, here's everything that I care about number wise that goes into this. Then I have already programmed the algorithm, and so I can separately have something render this, and then being able to see that, it was like, oh, wait, how come everything isn't like this?
Right.
Everything should be like this. And then I just ended up talking to some folks and that worked in either animation, film, or games, and found out that there was a whole series of people that basically do exactly this, of make the tools for the people that are interested in making the art, so that they can focus on the art, and getting rid of this like middle abstraction software layer as much as possible. Just was the thing that excited me the most, because I get to immediately see the thing that I'm making. But I know that I'm not the best storyteller, and so I'm handing this off to the person that is. And it's really cool to be able to hand something over to somebody, and then they come back and like, here's this thing that I made that I would have no way of even beginning to comprehend how it was possible. But I took your thing, and it was like, oh, now I had this new series of ideas that never would have occurred to me before, and it took me in this direction. And that's just like so rewarding to be in the position to do for somebody.
I think that's so cool. I kind of knew some of that, but having a space to just say like, please just explain, and have Andrew like being like, no, specifically like, how'd you end up in that? That's cool. I'm sure you have other questions, Andrew and Astrid. It really is this idea of like, if there's curiosities to you, feel free to jump in. But I do just want to go back and ask a follow up on the idea of this life's work is story, because like, what an exciting thing to hear from anybody. I think especially like younger people, to be able to have this conviction or confidence that came along and say like, no, I really feel like this is my life's calling. I think that that's kind of rare and begs more of, hey, can you say a little bit more about that?
I think story is the force that moves the universe, and people are motivated by story. Story inspires people in a way that other things don't. I don't know what it is that hijacks our brains, that like once we have a narrative attached to something, that becomes so much easier to remember. It becomes more intelligible. Just this like even something simple as like thing does thing to other thing, like that structure already like is so much more intelligible than if I was to describe something in the term of like a Platonic realm, where like abstract ideas, it's very hard for somebody to kind of wrap their head around a series of abstract ideas. But if you present the ideas in a story, then they make sense and they resonate with people. And if you put characters in the story that have personalities and things that they care about and values that conflict with other people, and that then you can watch that conflict and evolve, and people latch on to it and they see themselves reflected in the characters, especially if they have overlapping values. And so we've seen this like time and time again throughout history, where a story dominates society for a period of time. And story is the thing that also inspires political movements, right? Like Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Martin Luther King would not be Martin Luther King if he had not given that speech. The story of Jesus has been the most powerful story that we've ever seen, and like has changed the shape of the world. Political institutions were rewritten because of it. On a like more microcosm, you have other political institutions that have been created and arose based on story, like Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead comes to mind, as like she's trying to convince the reader of a series of political and philosophical beliefs, but she's doing that through telling a story with characters that get the reader invested, and people did. And it now there's a whole series like movement of people that that read that book and believe the core ideas that I think wouldn't be around if she had just presented it as a series of philosophical arguments, for example, in like the sophist style. But presenting it as a story makes it more intelligible for people. And I think that just the average person very, very underrates the power of story and media in creating story and communicating story en masse.
I love that so much. I have two big reactions like leaping out of my chest. One is something I've always liked that the Coen brothers do in a lot of their movies is there be a moment within the movie where a protagonist or really eccentric side character will just start telling a story in the movie. You know, there once was a, and at the one time somebody did a, and just that opening one little line of once there was a man.
Yeah.
Something happens in my mind and body like a dopamine or whatever trigger. I'm like, oh man, what story are they going to tell inside the story? Like, so there is like an effect that happens to us when anybody sits down to tell a really good, just oratory, like tale or fable or whatever. And I love that that's the thing about us, even if I don't fully understand it. And then the second one is so random, but I hope that there's a connection, is that I think about Taylor Swift a lot like this. I really like Taylor Swift. I wouldn't call myself a Swiftie, but maybe I am because I haven't listened to all the songs or know all of the people she's dated or all these intricate things. But my friends, I have friends that are like really they know everything. Like one of them I wanted to bring on, Andrew, because she's so much fun to talk to. She knows all these things. But I really enjoy, as a singer-songwriter who's writing very personal and opening up her like life to write about things, I find one of the big reasons I think that she's so successful, and I know there's a lot, is this idea of story and openness and kind of trying to process their own grief, curiosity, excitement through the songwriting process and then make it public. And I think that that's maybe it's discussed a ton, but I feel like a lot of the conversations that I hear is like, why is Taylor so successful, or her live shows are so good, or it's this, and I know that it's probably hard to figure out what the number one reason is, but I just think that that's a really big one,
even you talk about her live shows, like the number of people that are involved in that production that are professional storytellers is I think you wouldn't believe it.
I probably wouldn't. I hadn't thought about that,
but absolutely, it's very intentional that the entire way that those shows are put on is you start with a blank slate, and then you put a series of emotions. I want people to go on an emotional journey from here to here, and I want it to get resolved over here. And how are we going to take people through this? And then how are we going to build a story that gets people to these emotional highs and lows? And that takes place not just in her live music, but also song to song, of course. Almost every song of hers, like she blew up by singing Teardrops on My Guitar, right? And that's a song about her being in high school and having a crush on somebody that's unrequited, and then being really sad and lost in the emotion of that. And like she's a brilliant story writer.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you said that too, because I have no idea if Andrew's ever listened to Taylor. He's in Nashville, so I just want to assume that he's listened to Taylor Swift, like Taylor Swift. I have no idea.
I've actually got a pretty wild story that involves Taylor Swift from when I was much younger. But
just go.
No,
tell me.
So we actually used to have this thing here downtown Nashville called River Stages, and then it changed its name to Dancing in the District, and it had all of these things. But when we were kids, like when I was in high school, it was the thing. We all drove downtown. If we had a license and you had a car, on Thursday nights, you were downtown at Riverfront for this free concert.
Okay.
And I remember going because my buddy's local band got as the headliner for the local stage. Yeah. This was a metal show. This was not no pop, no country. Like this was local metal bands. But for some reason, this tiny little girl from I don't remember, Connecticut or wherever she's from, comes up on stage with an acoustic guitar, and there's this giant banner that says presenting Taylor Swift. And I mean, if she was 16, 15 years old, I'd be surprised.
Yeah.
I mean, tiny little frail Taylor up there playing guitar, playing like 3 or 4 songs. And it was the craziest ambiance, the craziest environment I've ever been in. Because you have all these people here to see this metal show, or like at least
This is
if they're not there
wild.
to see it, yeah, they're there for the fact that it's a free concert
Yeah.
downtown. But the headlining act is a local metal band that won their place on the stage, and then Taylor Swift opens up and is just playing. But like the whole place is captivated. They're like, we don't know why, but we're all into it in a way that doesn't really make sense. But it's for whatever she does, however she does it, there's a chord that she strikes that is just like, whether it's just like this overwhelming direct truth that's just like pouring out of her that's like very recognizable, or it's you know, a multitude of other things. I have no idea. But I mean, I remember being, I think I was 16, 17 years old, just sitting there like, okay, like I'm listening to it. I didn't leave. I didn't stop paying attention. So there's something to that world for sure, on who she is and why she
That's
is.
so wild. You've never told me that story, and I'm so glad you did. And I have to share this quick anecdote because it has like the opposite thing happened in a way that I'll just say it. I was super into like emo screamo, especially like Christian emo screamo, but just general emo screamo in high school. There was a band playing at a church that I really wanted to see called Kids in the Way. Super emo, super underground indie Christian band. And their van like blew a tire on the way from Orlando or something, so they just couldn't make it. And so the music's starting, and they're like, "Oh, we're just gonna have the starter. They're gonna like take over." And I was like so bummed out. I liked this band so much, I just left. And it like came to find out like Paramore was the band that was taking over.
No way.
And I've just endlessly given like so much shit by so many of my friends for so long because they were like, you just like left Paramore a church in Cape Coral, Florida because you wanted to see some band that nobody else has ever heard of since.
That's amazing.
So I'm glad that you stayed, Andrew, is my point. I'm glad you didn't leave.
Yeah, I'm actually sending you the photo. 1 second.
Please. Oh my God. I would love to have it. Well, I was going to say, I'll say this while you're looking for the photo. I haven't seen Taylor yet. My sister's seen it twice. A couple of my really good friends have seen her, and they just raved, raved. And they're not hyperbolic people by nature. And so I really want to go see it now too. But when I was thinking about eras, I was thinking that especially from a story standpoint, it almost invites all of us to think of our lives in chapters and to do this really unique, cool thing of going through these chapters in the concert, which is, I assume, how it goes. It kind of goes through her album, her like discography. And so I do think there's just something, like, I have the photo for me. I think there's something wildly cool about, it's not just all about Taylor. There's a sense of us coming in there and thinking about our own lives going through these eras. Oh my God, it's real. This is a real story. He's got the picture with the banner of Taylor.
There's a video online of this concert.
Whoa!
You can watch it on YouTube. I recognize that shot.
All right, well, that's what I'm doing tonight. That's amazing. Thank you for giving such a lovely answer on story, by the way. I really like that. I love writing, and I love story, and I went to school for writing. And like when I was in school for writing, I was running a business and I was starting an entrepreneurship, and I was like, this just applies to everything. I was just like, everything I'm learning in like my creative writing class, like legitimately can just apply to all these other facets of my life. And even like my romantic relationships, whatever it was, I was like, oh my God, we should have more people that aren't even necessarily don't think of themselves as writers, drawing in on some of the wisdom of storytelling and how it can apply in all these other ways. And it looks like not only have you drawn in on that wisdom, this is like a passion point for you. This is something you're striving towards. And we can talk about other topics. I just wanted to ask really quickly what it looks like to you to be growing in that space, whether it's like some people be like, I'm going to take seminars or online, or I'm going to like buy these books or go to YouTube, or I'm just going to tell more stories. Like, I'm just curious, like some of the things that you've outlined for yourself as you wanted to, become a better storyteller.
Yeah, it's all of the above. I've taken private lessons in like specific media from people that I respect, especially a lot in music. It's everything from like tutoring in songwriting to creative writing to having somebody that does like, he literally is the person that designed like Taylor's first tour stage. Like he used to give lessons on like, here's the things that I'm teaching other people, and here's how I think about things. And here's how to think about a different like framework to think about live music. That's basically a story. Um, uh, YouTube videos, especially on like media that I consider myself very mediocre at, which is mostly like I'm very good at taking something and turning it into a tool that gives somebody else the ability to make these creative decisions. But I really don't understand a lot of the foundational creative language, and so that kind of requires a lot of intentional study for me that doesn't come naturally. Books are a thing that I read incessantly. One just arrived a couple of weeks ago that's like visual art of visual storytelling, or design as storytelling, I think is the title of it. It's just an arts history and art science book, on like it goes over everything as boring from like, here's like a graph, and here's the different types of graph, and here's the different stories that those are trying to tell. And so being intentional about when you're trying to communicate something visually to somebody else, being really deliberate about the kind of graph that you picked so that you're telling the right story. So it could be something as granular as that, or as large as, here's the hero's journey, and studying other great stories. I find probably the most effective lesson, though, is just consuming the great stories over and over and over again. So if you find if you're studying storytelling and a film really resonates with you, don't feel bad about watching it 80 times over the course of your life, maybe. Like I find that this is a thing that a lot of the great filmmakers all have in common is, whether the film's Lawrence of Arabia or Jaws or whatever it is, that like the people that are making the films that I think are great always come back to and talk about like the 1 to 3 films that they think tell a perfect story, and really, really study them through and through. I think there's a lot of value in that.
I really love that advice. That is really similar to something that we learned in one of my programs that was about finding a publisher. So for like writing a book, and it was like, believe it or not, like go and find one of your favorite books that you feel is the most in tune with you. Like you just feel like it was meant for you, and just keep reading it and keep studying the structure, the decisions that are made strategically with the, there's only so much time in a film. There's almost, so many pages in a book. What did they do? How did they do it? And then who published the book? Who were their agent? And like all these other ways of reverse engineering. And I love reverse engineering and what you can learn from it. But I really like that too. Like, oh man, I love Jaws. I've seen Jaws probably like 20 times, and I hope I see it another 20 times. I could just talk about Jaws, but I am curious. I have this like itch that I'm feeling that I want to scratch, which is like, okay, obviously I'm very passionate about story, and Astrid passionate about story, and I'm like, I have no idea what Andrew thinks about story in his life or his professional field or anything. So I'm just curious what comes up for you, Andrew.
Well, the funny thing is it's literally what I just wrote down, is that everything that you're saying about story and about how you draw inspiration and what that looks like. And you kept saying, if you find something that you enjoy, watch it again, read it again. That's the exact same way that I feel about food. And it's the exact same way that I talk to people that I work with in the food world about navigating their curiosity and their creativity within the space of food and hospitality and mixology. It's just exactly that. It's find something that resonates and then go back to it over and over and over again. There's dishes in the world that I will go and eat hundreds of times. There's restaurants that I will go to every time I go to a certain place because of how it makes me feel, how energized it makes me when I leave there, then how excited I am to take that feeling and say, how do I transcribe that in my creative channel, in my creative outlet? And the way that you all were talking about it was like this, I've never put it in those words. I've never looked at it in that way. And it's just been continuously resonating because we talk about storytelling with food. And it's a big part of my job is to connect our products to the person who's going to be using and facilitating that product to their guest in their restaurant. And how do I convey a story of from farm to table that resonates enough with the chef, enough with the server, enough with the bartender, that they're willing and able to convey that message and that story to the guest that's enjoying the product. But yeah, I don't know that I've ever looked at it through the like lens that we're talking about here, and I find that super fascinating.
Yeah, same. I'm really glad we just kind of organically stumbled upon all of this. So I think of you, Astrid, as a deeply curious person, which makes conversation easy. The conversations I've had with you, which haven't been a ton, we haven't known each other that long, but I have just genuinely felt better every time I've left a conversation with you, in my body, in my mind. Like my day was better because we just talked, openly. And so this is very open ended, right? But that's kind of how Andrew and I have been doing this. But I am really wanting to know what is capturing your curiosity recently. I know you have a book coming in about visual design, but for somebody that is so, I think, outrageously curious relative to most people I meet, it begs the question: what's capturing your curiosity right now?
Yeah, wow. I think I'm not going to answer the question you asked. I'm going to answer an adjacent
Good.
question as a cop out.
I love it. Thank you.
Which is the thing that has dominated my curiosity, like in the recent past, has been finance, and trying to understand markets and why people value things differently and how different people value things, um, and how we've raised weird situations like the the largest companies on earth, the value of their stock price plummeting like 70%, like Meta, or Facebook as it used to be known, and then like going right back up within a year. How is that that doesn't, what's going on? Like, and trying to understand all of the intricacies of accounting nonsense and ways in which people could take the same financial information but report it differently for various different reasons, and end up at very different outcomes, even though there's the same thing going on, I think is an important thing to understand, if you're trying to understand markets and how other people are thinking about things and valuing things. Basically, just trying to become fluent in the language of finance.
And you're hungry for it too, right? Just like I think this is true about you. You'll read earnings reports.
Yeah, I do for fun, like every day. Yeah, I 10Ks and 10Qs. I live in it. If
Wait, what's that mean? Is
probably
that like a
doesn't mean
slogan or a
anything. Yeah.
phrase? Yeah.
So the SEC, which is in the United States, the financial regulatory body at a federal level, requires that companies to remain publicly traded on certain exchanges, like the NASDAQ, for example, or the New York Stock Exchange are probably the two biggest ones that people have heard of before. If you want to remain publicly traded, there's a whole bunch of rules that you have to follow that those exchanges enforce, like collaboratively with. They're basically forced to by the SEC. And a couple of those requirements to remain publicly traded companies are that you file quarterly reports, and there's laws and regulations about what needs to be included in those. And the 10Q and 10K are the quarterly or annual versions of those financial reports that I will find myself reading on the regular.
So the background for Andrew and I'll let Andrew obviously give their background, but I had no investment knowledge, no stock management knowledge, none of that. Even though I went to a very cool school when it comes to investing, they were known in Florida for having their own private funds that they let the students run. And they were like pretty successful. And so I had friends that I went to school with because I was in the business school, but I was doing like management that was like super psychological driven and really weird professors doing weird stuff. I had a professor who sat in the back of the class on the first day and didn't say anything for 15 minutes. And then somebody from student council was in the class. They went to the front. They're like, we can leave, guys. We are not going to be punished. It's been 15 minutes. The professor isn't here. And the professor he's like, I'm here. I'm in the back. And they're like wearing cargo shorts and this shirt that had the TV show Lost on it with visible holes in it. And they're like, I'm here. They didn't say anything else. They just said, I'm here.
Yeah.
And so then we're just sitting in silence. We're just like sitting in like these 10 seconds that feels like 10 minutes of uncomfortable silence. And me or somebody is like so are we going to start class? And then once again, like very short, but very assertive, like, would you guys like to start class? And then just silence.
Yeah.
Right. And then we're like, yes. And they're like, how would you like to begin? And I won't draw it out because it was an hour of that.
Okay.
But his whole thing was, you're coming to school. If I don't do my best to get you to critically think for yourself, then you're just going to graduate business school and go to a job and just learn to do whatever your supervisor tells you to do, or yearn and hope that your supervisor breaks everything down into really easy to understand elements, and that's what you will think success is. And the idea is that you need to understand you're going into like fluid organizations that in their own way are they're like their own organisms. And you have to get used to uncertainty, and you have to get used to not just being like, well, what do we do now? And what's on the exam? And so I was doing that. Meanwhile, my friends were in like the finance, running their own fund, learning about all the stuff that I never learned about. So my background is I never really knew that much about it. I didn't have any retirement money. I wasn't putting anything into a 401k. I just wasn't doing any of the stuff that I've now learned. I'm really glad that I'm doing. And when I met you, it was such a wonderful time that you were generous enough to like meet one-on-one and explain some of the things you learned, or just point me in the direction of like, hey, I don't want to be like, pedestalized or, deified. Here's some books, here's some thoughts. What are your questions? And I can learn about the market, because I had sold my businesses and I was like, I want to be responsible with some of the money that's come out of this and really think about, for somebody that doesn't have parents that played in the market and weren't like coming to me and saying, do this. And not a lot of my peers knew what to do. I was like, wow, it's kind of overwhelming and intimidating to be like, what is the stock market and how do I do it? And what the hell is an index fund? And what is the S&P 500? So I guess one way I was telling the story of where my background to all of it was just deep discomfort. In the last couple of years, I've learned a lot, but also like a kind of a natural just gratitude that I want to share with you for being generous and being somebody that has taught me a lot, and who I think very generously publicly will write threads about your opinions and thoughts on some of these things in a way that's accessible for anybody that's watching this too. So that's a little bit of my background. I'm somebody that's excited to keep trying to learn more because I found it way more interesting than I would have previously realized, but don't have any background in it. But Andrew, I'm curious, what's your interest or awareness when it comes to the market?
15 minutes ago, it was at a 0. And now it's peaked. I'm definitely intrigued. It's one of those things. I think it's like the barrier to entry is just like there's so much information out there, and it's like where do you start? What's the purpose of any of this? Does it actually matter? Is there an impact that I'll see? I don't have answers to any of that. I don't pretend to know anything about it. I blissfully live my life in ignorance around all things finance, and luckily my wife is the money person. If it was me, I'd live in constant fear of what is to come financially for the rest of my life. Money just never crosses my mind, and I don't know if that's like a thing to say that comes from the privilege to be able to say it. I don't know. I have no idea, but I've never had a money conversation with my parents. It's never been a thing that I've looked at, been interested in, or really cared about in any way. I just want to do cool shit. And if money gets me there, great. If it doesn't, who cares?
Yeah.
So I've never just really had an interest in the stock market. But this is like, I don't know if it's what Charlie's story about the guy sitting in the back of the class with a Holy Lost shirt that I'm like, I want that. Or do I want to learn about the stock exchange? I don't know, but I'm going to do both. I'm going to find both and pursue both.
Yeah, not to like try to like set you up, Astrid, to make some grand explanation for why it's interesting, because do what thou will. But what a great showcase for how story is so important, because the books that I've read since were written clearly from somebody that wanted to break down complicated buzzwords and terminology and understood the sense of me feeling intimidated and was like, no, like, we can tell some stories and you'll quickly understand this on a basic level. At least you won't be a master, but you won't feel like you're locked outside, because I'm going to use story to make this not feel so overwhelming. And then like once that magic thing happens and you don't feel so blockaded, or like you don't have the mind to understand this, or you're not built to be one of the people that kind of get it, then all of a sudden it's like, okay, yeah, now I would hear people talk more about like what's going on and how these things are happening. And it is like wildly interesting in the same way that almost like religious groups and faith and like currency and all these other things are like kind of wild as far as the power of belief and everything. So I would love Astrid just to hear a little bit more about the how or the why that it became such a curious thing to you that you were one of these rare people that were actually reading the 10Ks and 10Qs. Did I say that right?
That's right, you did. Yeah, it first became a thing that was interesting to me because, wow, okay. Speaking of stories, so I lived while I was going to school in a place called Boise, Idaho. And while I was there, I had this neighbor who was in his early 70s, and he showed up at every political event. It didn't matter whether it was a right-wing event, a left-wing event, a socialist, communist event, the anarchist event. He was there, and he would talk to people. And if anybody who'd met Kenneth, it didn't matter who you were, could have a conversation with Kenneth where he would find what you cared about, and he would be interested in having a conversation with you about it. And if you went over to Kenneth's house, you walk into his apartment and it's just books. The furniture is covered in books. The walls, you can't see them because they're floor to almost ceiling books the whole way. And you walk around this man's apartment, and if you pointed to a book and you said the title or you said the author, he could tell you about this book. He could give you a full synopsis of the book. If you were curious, he could tell you when it was written, by whom, what else was going on in the world at that time, what the author was responding to. If the author published a book that was controversial in its field, for example, he knew that other people had responded to, and he could tell you about those books and like what they had to say too. So this man was just a walking library. And one day, it would have been just before Christmas, like a couple of days before Christmas, in 2000 and was it 19? He knocks on my door, and I answer the door, and he's there wearing his like Christmassy Santa hat and gloves because it was cold outside, and also a face mask. And I was like, "Hey, Kenneth, what's up?" He's like, "Oh, nothing much. Just wanted to see how you're doing, what's going on, and that you're okay. And wondered if you'd paid attention to the news lately or heard anything about Wuhan." And I was like, Wuhan? Isn't that like a city in China or something? And he's like, yeah, I don't know, just been seeing some things that are a little weird, and I just think it's worth paying attention to. That's all. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, no, I don't know anything about Wuhan or what's going on there. Like, what's weird going on there? He's like, oh, just like a virus kind of thing that's like, I don't know. I've never really seen anything like this before. I don't know how to describe it, but I think this is going to be a big deal. And yeah, I just wanted to see if you knew anything about it or had any thoughts about it. I was like, well, I don't know anything. This is news to me that there's something important going on in this town in China that I couldn't put on a map. And I was like, oh, okay, no worries then. I'll see you around. And he just leaves. So I'm there, just stood at my door, like, okay, clearly, if Kenneth thinks that this is important, this is probably important. So I go to Wikipedia, start look at where even Wuhan is on a map. I don't know. And trying to see if I can find any news. I couldn't find anything, so I was like, I don't know what Kenneth is talking about. A couple of days later, I start seeing articles, and the thing that happened on the day that he had showed up at my house was a complete shutdown of the city. Like, the entire city went on lockdown in an effort to contain what we now know as the coronavirus. And this was not yet like publicly a knowable thing in the English language. But he just happened to be a very online, paying attention kind of a person. He's a prolific Wikipedia editor. A week later-ish, he comes to my house again. So this is like first week of January. He's like, I assume by now you have an idea of what's going on. I just wanted to say that I've started a Wikipedia article about this. And so he's the author of the coronavirus Wikipedia article.
Wow.
That has a full timeline of events. And so him and about a half dozen other people started tracking things in real time all over the world as this was unfolding. And the thing that he saw really early and caught on to was that this was really something really unusual was going on. And by the time he figured out that this is starting to look like it could be a pandemic, he started cataloging things. The thing that he said to me at my door the second time was, I think this is the most important thing that will happen in my lifetime. And that when he said that, I immediately knew that he was right. And when somebody in their 70s says this is the most important thing to happen in my lifetime, that's the most well-read person you know, you can't not pay attention. And the conclusion that I came to a couple of days later was, yeah, he's right. This is going to be a big deal. This is going to be a pandemic. And my immediate first thought was, what am I going to do? What am I going to do with this knowledge? Because nobody's talking about this yet. Very few people are thinking about that. And my brain immediately went to, how can I make money? Because this seems like a really big opportunity to make a lot of money in a series of crises that will unfold. And trying to understand what those crises are going to be and be in a position to be early on them felt like a feasible thing. And that's what sent me down the journey of learning and understanding finance was my eclectic friend down the street just showing
Kenneth.
up one day. Kenneth, yeah.
Andrew, come on, that's good. That is good storytelling.
That's incredible.
That is not bad storytelling. It is good.
No.
It's good.
I just kept thinking when you were like, as soon as you pivoted and tied it back to the finance side of it, I was like, man, I'm so glad you went down the road of like actually looking at the stock market and trends and all that, as opposed to what people here did, which was hoard toilet paper and sanitizer and then try to resell it to make money. So I'm glad what you did was a little bit more approachable and maybe, a little bit more ethical. So
when he did show up at my house the second time, some of the things that he said were, I just want to let you know if you need anything that I just got back from Costco. So I have lots of toilet paper, hand sanitizer, wipes, what did he say? Beans, rice, canned goods, of just like everything. And then of course,
right.
three weeks later, you go to the grocery store, there's no canned goods. They're sold out of sugar, flour, rice, like toilet paper.
He was 3 weeks?
He was 3 weeks ahead. Yeah.
That's incredible. And this was in Boise.
Yeah, that's right.
And
Fun
so
fact
did you
about
spend...
Idaho, Andrew. That's where I got COVID for the first time, was traveling in Idaho. It's all connected.
Did you spend the pandemic in Idaho?
I did, yes.
And you're in LA now?
That's right. Yep.
So obviously being in Idaho and being in LA are probably some of the most polar opposite things, places you could be. What was that like coming out of the pandemic going into LA? Like, I can only imagine the culture shock.
I love that question.
Like, I don't even know how to ask it, to be honest with you, but what was that like? Holy shit.
When I was in Idaho, I spent the first half of the pandemic in Boise living with my sister, who has a not the greatest of immune system. So I basically didn't leave the house for more than a year. And then when I moved out of Boise, I went to this tiny rural place in Idaho that's a town of like, population 3,000 optimistically. And it's the kind of town where there's one grocery store and a couple gas stations, and the person scanning your groceries knows you on a first name basis and knows what's going on in your life before you tell them.
Right.
And going from that kind of a place to a big city felt just like, oh, that's right. There's people. I don't have to see everybody through a computer screen. And it was really like a relief to be around people that I felt connection to and related to, rather than having to do it virtually. Was just like on top of the pandemic isolation already, felt like I was coming from a very isolated place to now a very like welcoming community place.
I want to ask a question about the the process to go from, okay, I think I want to learn more. I think there's a once in a lifetime or beyond that opportunity here. And I think it'd be a good time to learn more about this subject. The question of like how long it took before you really started to see some of the gains of your hard work of learning. And listen, because Andrew and I talk about this sometimes when it comes to entrepreneurship, but I think it's Bill Gates. But I don't know if I'm misquoting. It doesn't matter. It's fine. If I'm misquoting him, he can take it. It was you usually kind of overestimate what you can get done in 1 year, but you underestimate what can be done in 10 years, right? And so I really think that you are quite confident in a lot of ways that you probably weren't 4 years ago, and have actually been successful. I don't know to the extent you've been successful, but I know you've been successful trading and living in this world. And so I kind of curious how that resonates with you as far as, I can't imagine that 2 months into your learning that you were like, killing it on Charles Schwab or whatever.
Yeah.
But, I'm curious about that journey because I think probably a lot of people are like, that's cool, but Astrid is like a unicorn. Some people can just decide they're going to pick up books and learn all this stuff. That's too difficult for me, or would take too long, or would take 15 years and I don't have the time. But I genuinely like to believe that people can learn more than they believe they can learn, but it does maybe take more time than they expect, and that's okay. So it's a really long way to ask that simple question of kind of how that timeline or that learning curve, I guess, was for you.
It was probably almost 7 to 9 months before I did anything financially related after intentionally going, this is the thing I need to do. And so by the time I was even at a place where I felt comfortable enough to do anything with money, we were like, well, the world had already figured out we're in a pandemic. And so my focus very much became like, okay, now how is the world different now that people don't understand yet? And what's going to happen as a result of people coming to understand where we are now and how that's different than what came before. And so, yeah, it was probably 7 to 9 months before I decided to put my money somewhere for like the first trade. And then that snowballed from there. And also for context, like when I was a college student, before that, we like worked as a chef. And so I had a whole lot of not very much money saved up. I think like I started with $7,000 in 2020. And so when I say like I made 300% that year, that sounds really impressive. But realistically, that's like not even a part-time job. And so, yeah, I feel like I got really lucky in seeing a couple of things that other people weren't seeing yet. But really didn't feel like I had my feet under me until probably a year ago. And I think that the getting like the big picture right in a way that was really rare opportunity. Like how often in your lifetime are you going to see the price of oil trade for negative money? Probably not again. But getting paid to buy oil is a once in a lifetime opportunity, for example, that I don't expect to see again. And there's so many ways that you can do that, and most of the ways available to people are like pretty mediocre and not going to capture the biggest upside. And that doesn't really matter as long as you get the idea of like, oh, you get paid to buy oil right now, and oil's probably going to be worth something if the pandemic doesn't last forever. And so even though the way in which I invested in oil was like very mediocre, and I could have made 10x more if I was smarter about it and didn't know enough to do that, I still ended out all right. But that kind of carried me until the next like 3 years, where now I feel like I have a footing under me. And when weird, like much smaller niche micro things come up, that I can understand what's going on and be intelligent about things. And yeah, it's probably like 3 years before I felt like I've got to that point.
Thank you for that. I really enjoyed that answer. Andrew, I feel like I saw you. I didn't know if you had something you wanted to ask.
No, I've got two questions. One of them
Yeah.
goes way back to the very beginning
Okay.
and has nothing to do with what we just talked about
Perfect.
at all. So I'll save that one for a little bit later. But the question that I have about this is that all of this to me comes from a spark. And the spark was generated from Kenneth.
That's right.
And this is completely out of left field, but all I kept thinking about is as we continue to evolve as a society and we continue to find ourselves pushing towards efficiency, pushing towards making things easier on us, making things like access to information. How does Kenneth exist in 30 years?
Yeah.
Like, I can't imagine going up to a millennial in 30 years and walking into their house and seeing a room full of books that they just know inside and out and can give you that story. And then that literally carries their personality and who they are to the community around them.
Yeah.
So, like, I guess my question is, what does that person look like in 30 years? And
Wait,
does that person?
Are you asking if the Kenneths are going to die out? Because I don't know if I'm ready for that conversation.
I'm not ready for that. I'm not ready for that either. I want to be very clear. But that's like, as we're talking about all of this, right? Like when you went down your journey of learning about finance, I imagine that was a very solo journey. You weren't around hundreds of people going, "This is finance." Like everybody talked. Like you dug in on your own. You looked at it, but there wasn't this, community around it that supported it. But like the thing that really attracted me to the story about Kenneth that you told was like, why is he showing up to the political rallies? Why is he sort of stockpiling, to use a better word than hoarding, all of these books and all of this information? And how does that look when you share that with somebody else? And I think that's really cool about what this conversation is that we're asking you to do the same thing with the things that you're curious about. How do we progress that in society without losing it by doing more efficient? And that has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but that's where my brain went. That's what that weird facial twitch was, Charlie, that you picked up on.
I think Kenneth is a one of one, unfortunately. I've to this day I've not for want of looking, not encountered another Kenneth. But I think the thing that we're literally doing right now is the thing that we'll see a lot more of in the future, of people connecting over we're in an era of radio has returned, where radio used to be this wild open platform where people could just broadcast signals, before it became a federally regulated thing, and people would just get up and turn on and talk to the neighbors, and tell stories to each other, and gradually that became through the series of several hundred to thousand bankruptcies and lawsuits, a very tightly controlled, regulated thing, broadcasting radio waves. And now we're kind of in an era where we've returned to it through podcasting, where people are just talking to their friends again.
Beautiful, Astrid. I love that.
Yeah,
I love the way you explain that. So I don't even mean to interrupt.
No, you're good.
That's really beautiful, actually.
Yeah,
I just want more pirate radio.
Yeah,
that's good. Like that's the bridge that we need to find, is how do we get back to that?
I feel like we already are there, and
yeah,
it just has taken a new media, but it's the same thing of just people having conversations with each other. And
what's funny, because that's part of what you said, this is what we're doing right now, right? I had this resistance to doing a podcast. Andrew was like, why don't we do this thing? I think it would, we have good chemistry. It could be really fun. And I had, these kind of like voices in me rise up and thinking about how people perceive me and what am I expecting? And do I want some type of validation, a certain amount of downloads or fame? And I really like my anonymity, and just all these voices, all this noise just like comes up immediately and is just scattering everything. And I'm like, hey man, I don't know. Let's check back in a couple months. And then the magic kind of thing that happened, my girlfriend Kat was part of this, our community that we've met, some of the people online through Twitter, Astrid included, was part of this, where kind of realized, one, there's an art to conversation, and there's creation and creativity that can flow from doing things like this, and just the pursuit of that has so much meaning in of itself. And then two, how do I expect to find some of the most wonderful relationships or some of the people that I want to find in the world if I'm not putting myself out there?
Yeah.
Whether that's writing an essay about my life, it's showing up to an event, going and knocking on my neighbor's door with baked goods, whatever it is. And when I saw it as that, this doesn't have to be let's get sponsors and I hope that we can compete with the other 15,000 podcasts. And instead I had this kind of switch to like, what if the little clips of some of my favorite people that I've talked to or some of my favorite stories of knowledge I've learned that I'm sharing has this really cool chance, because just like you said, everything's kind of reverted back to where you can be in the pocket of somebody, you can be in somebody's hand. What if that opens up my world to wonderful connections and wonderful things that otherwise I'm closing myself off to because I'm allowing all this noise in my head. So that's a big part of the reason that this exists. And I just hadn't heard it described the way you just described it. And I'm going to be thinking about that. I think it's really beautiful. So thank you for that. And also, Andrew, I am curious, this other question that is way back at the beginning, the other question that you said you wanted to wait to ask.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to jump back into the very beginning, it's you were talking when we first started the podcast about facilitating for creativity. And the thing that kept popping up into my head is like, how do you draw the line between facilitate and influence? And do you want to have influence, or do you just want to facilitate the tool, the avenue, whatever, for somebody else to be creative? And if that's the case, what does the influence piece look like that you would want to have, or that you do want to keep, maybe a grip on for your own use later on down the road? Or is there like a collaboration piece that falls into that? But yeah, just what's the difference between facilitate and influence that you see? And is there a hard line between the two when you develop?
I love this question. This is my favorite question, Andrew.
Hey.
So have you heard the name Marshall McLuhan before?
I have not.
You have not? Okay.
No.
Marshall McLuhan is a Canadian thinker, philosopher. And Marshall McLuhan, who's now deceased, was active in like 50s, 60s during the era of kind of the Wild West of radio and the beginning of television. And he developed the field or started the field that we now know as critical media studies. And the driving question behind Marshall McLuhan's work is, to what degree is society shaped by the media that we choose to communicate with each other in? And so he focused on thinking of writing, the written word, as an abstract thing rather than the words that somebody says. What is writing as a media saying? What is that medium inherently moving somebody towards when they're using it? And what is the media that is radio saying? What is just the mode communicating, and what is implied through engaging in this mode? And same with television. And I find that question endlessly interesting and rewarding. And the kind of loose place where I've found myself now is, I think that the medium that one chooses to operate through dictates the outcome, right? If you have a hammer, it's designed to do two things. If you have a screwdriver, it's designed to do one thing. And the affordances given to you by a technology limit the scope of possibility, and so drive the destination. And I think that it's way more powerful than people realize. And so I very much think of myself and people who do the kind of thing that I do as the secret drivers of civilization, and that it's like a heavy burden to bear. And I feel like it's really daunting and overwhelming if I dwelled on it too much. But I think that very much, like, the person that designed Tinder had more influence on society than any single person has in the United States in the last decade. One person. Wow. Like the original designer of that app. And we live in a society, as long as we're going to be living in a society dominated by these like super apps, and where media has these fat right tails, where the media that lands and resonates really resonates, and lots of people are going to see it and connect with it, that the people that are designing the things that limit the scope and scale of possibility are really making the decisions, even if they don't think of themselves as doing so.
Wow. That was a really good answer. And got me really thinking about the people behind the thing and the choices made for what the tool can do, and then the waterfall eventually that happens. Oh my god. Sorry, I know it was your question, Andrew. Just like, wow.
No, I mean, it's funny you say that, and I'm sure you've seen this giant thing behind me that says what it says. And it's funny because when the guy who made this for me, we're actually interviewing in a couple of weeks, and I'm really excited about it. But the whole idea of this is very similar to what you said, which is like, people always talk about creativity as being this thing that has to be outside the box. It has to be something that is constructed outside of the normal realm of thinking. And for me, with food, that doesn't exist, right? I'm never going to create something that wasn't already something before. So the reason why this guy has a blindfold on that says squares, because the whole idea of creativity is like, I'm going to force you to think outside of the box. Well, my view on it is that I think creativity lives and breathes so much more inside of a box. Like when you said a hammer is designed to do two things, the first thing I wanted to do was argue with you on why I can prove that there's multiple uses for a hammer outside of driving a nail and pulling a nail, and that we'll go down that path and just. But and for me, that's the fun. That's the beauty of it, is that my guess is, my takeaway from that is, there's way more uses for a hammer than the two that you mentioned, which has nothing to do with the relevancy of the conversation, is vastly different than what Charlie took away from it. And that's the exact reason why I love doing these podcasts and having these conversations, is because we all go off in so many different directions. But how do we bring it back down to the core of what we're here to talk about, which is absolutely nothing, and I love it.
Which I kind of needed you to do that, because I was like spiraling over here thinking about the people in a small room doing decisions that we don't think about, where they are in the org chart, potentially having disastrous forever consequences on our psyche and on where we're developing as I was spiraling. So for you to bring it back was quite helpful. We've been going for over an hour. This has been so freaking good. What we usually do at this point is we kind of allow space for everybody involved to ask any kind of last curiosity or make a statement or whatever it is before we end. And mine is just because I'd have to ask it, is you did have a job as a chef, and then obviously Andrew has had jobs as chefs, and I just like am curious about the similarity or difference of that first job, whatever, the very first time you're in a kitchen and somebody's paying you to be in a kitchen. So I'm just curious about how you ended up in a kitchen.
Oh boy, I wanted to have the option to be a chef, and so at the age of 17, I got a chef certification while I was living in Europe, and found myself working other odd service jobs. And one day, one of the guys that I was working with, his wife came in, and she was talking about how she didn't know what she was going to do because the chef for her restaurant had just quit on no notice, and they're in a crisis, and they just failed 2 health inspections in a row, and if they fail the third, then like the restaurant's you can't, it's irrecoverable, and then she like, this spark comes into her eyes, and she looks over at me. She's like, "Wait a minute! One time in a conversation, you mentioned that you had this. Like, are you a chef? Do you want to work in a kitchen?" And so that was the context for me working in as a chef for was just a random person that I knew in my life going, "Wait, is this a thing that you actually want to do? Were you serious when you said this?" Yeah, I'm curious, Andrew, how you managed to stumble your way into the hospitality business.
Wait, can I just ask real quick, because I want to ask it, because without making it a whole big thing, like a small thing, do you remember your first night? Like, do you remember the first, like, what you had to do as far as preparing to be like,
okay, yes, I do. The very first night, oh my gosh, I should go up at this restaurant, and somebody orders something on the menu, and I don't remember what the order was. It was a steak dish of some kind, and the line cooks all look at each other and go, "Where's so and so?" which is a name that I've never heard before. And somebody says, "Oh, he's off today." And then they come back to me and say, "We need this thing that I've never heard of before." And I go, a what? And what are you talking about? And it turns out that the one person who had made this a menu item never wrote down a recipe for it, didn't leave instructions, but it ended up on the menu. And that was the situation that I walked into, was somebody literally ordering an item that nobody in the kitchen knew what it was or how to make. And so we just winged it, and it worked out fine. The guest was happy, but we'd made something that had nothing to do with the thing they thought they were ordering. And that's the chaos that I stepped into at my first day.
Oh my god, I'm so glad I asked.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, I love that. That's incredible.
Yeah, that's my same question to you, Andrew, as far as how you ended up, or can you remember your first time in the kitchen and having the reins?
Yeah, like actually running my first kitchen. Yeah, I remember that. How I got there was when I was 18, I sold everything that I owned and I moved to New York City, which was the most eye-opening. Like the fact that I became a chef, my mom always joked about, was like, you didn't eat anything. You were the pickiest child in the world. Like all the way up until through high school, I was very, very picky about food. But I go to New York and I'm living there, and I lived at the last stop on the E train at Sutphin Boulevard, right off of Jamaica Avenue. And I remember walking up and down Jamaica Avenue and just going like, I don't know what these smells are at these carts, but there was this one guy who had this chicken something on a stick thing. And I remember going there and just like, okay, I know I'm not going to like it. Like that's what's going on in my head, but I have to know what this is because the smell is so intoxicating.
Yeah.
Then I ate it and I was like, holy crap, this is amazing. And I was like, what else do you have? And it just like spiraled. Then I realized like, this is something that I want to explore, that I want to dive into. And then fast forward the 4.5, 5 months, whatever I was there, and I hated it. I couldn't really get a footing. Come back to Tennessee with my tail in between my legs and start kind of like going around town. And at that time in Nashville, there was like 3 restaurants that were worth working at. And none of them were hiring me, who had no experience in that world outside of barbecue, catering, and fast food. So I hightailed it to Atlanta, went to culinary school, and was like, I'm going to figure this out. It's the best thing I've ever done and also the worst thing I've ever done at the exact same time. And both of those answers carry the exact same amount of weight.
Yeah.
But I'm very happy that it's been the journey that I've been on, because I've met some incredible people. I've been able to forge friendships, and just the network of people that I've been able to meet through food, and the conduit that food has then given me to have conversations like this is incredible. Honestly, I don't think it's funny. I don't think I just now put this together, but I don't believe this podcast would have started had I not known the chef in LA that I knew, that I went to his restaurant and then I convinced Charlie he had to come to that restaurant with me and eat. And the conversation that night at that restaurant is what we reflected on as, how do we recreate that in this environment? And that's how the podcast started.
That's amazing.
So that's crazy. I've never put that together. So thank both of you for getting my head right on that.
And what was it? How do you pronounce it? Is it pate? Is that right?
Oh yeah, the duck liver pate.
I was not interested in trying that, and you were like, you're gonna like it, and because of you, I tried it, and I love that place. We were talking about like watching the same movie over and over again, and then you were mentioning, and I almost brought up Antigua Nuevo because we've had such good conversation there, and I have no hesitancy in me to say, let's go back again, and think about why so many of these elements bring together such like intimacy and coziness and comfort. It's such a wonderful place. Do you remember your first night at all? Did you have any other sense of like chaos or just uncertainty or anything go wrong, or was it smooth sailing on the first night in the kitchen?
Me or
for
Astrid?
you, Andrew? Yeah.
Oh.
For you, you didn't have a recipe that hadn't been written down and somebody not call in. That's so wild, by the way.
To be very honest, I don't remember a ton from that time. Most of the first executive chef job that I had was a food truck, and I ran a food truck, and we opened up 2 more food trucks and then 2 restaurants underneath that food truck. And I was the really bright one that decided that we're going to start drinking at like 5, 6 o'clock in the morning while we're preparing to go do food truck events. So my mind wasn't focused on retaining memories. It was focused on a lot of a lot of fun and a lot of booze and a lot of that world. But I mean, food truck life was just insane. I mean, it's everything that you would have in a kitchen on wheels, and you're bringing your kitchen to the masses, and everything that can go wrong in those situations will go wrong and has gone wrong. I had a grill that was just turned on for 8 hours, glowing red, fall off of a table while we were driving because we forgot to anchor it back down. And I've got the guy that's with me in the food truck is like running back there to try to grab it. And I'm like, don't touch it. It's like obviously really hot. And he's like, so there, just stuff like that happened. But there's not like one day that stands out from like my first day somewhere. But
I don't think I realized that the food truck was so successul that it turned into multiple food trucks and then turned into its own.
Yeah, we had two restaurants
That's
going on
really
the
cool.
third, and our the guy that I was partnered with was just he was a not nice guy. And I decided I didn't want to be in business with not nice people.
Yeah.
And I walked away.
That is.
Well, I'm definitely going to ask you more. I'm glad we have a podcast together because we're getting into that at some point. This has been so wonderful. So I asked my big question. I want to give you each an opportunity. If you have any last curiosities or questions or anything you wanted to share before we end.
I don't know how you two met. I'm curious how you met. How is it you find yourselves on a podcast together?
You take that, Andrew. I've been doing. I want to hear your take on how we met.
So my wife and Charlie went to school together in Southwest Florida from what grade?
Sixth
grade on.
Okay.
And when the first time I went to Florida with my wife, we were just dating at the time, but I met Charlie and Ryan, and there was 2 or 3 other people that were there, and they're probably not going to be thrilled that I forgot them, but it's okay. We'll move on. But that's how we met originally, was through my wife. And the fun thing for me was like the very first night Charlie and I got together, which we actually talked about this, we played this geocache game.
Okay.
And Charlie had us driving all over Fort Myers and like picking up light posts and like sticking our hands under doormats of like weird broken down restaurants that look like pirate ships. It was just, but I remember going back and talking to my wife, and I was like, who is this guy? Like what, how does this person exist? And she was like, oh, this is Charlie. He's like one of my closest friends from high school. Like we love each other. We're and I was like, I need more, like whatever that is. I just know that I needed more of it. And that's my recollection of the first time we met. We may have met previous to that, but that's the first core thing that really sticks out. And ever since then, every time we got together, it seemed to go from like, oh, hey, how are you, pleasantries, into like very deep, very meaningful conversation very, very quickly.
Can I say something nice about your wife?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, obviously.
So I came from like a public elementary school, and then I went into a Southern Baptist like private school. And my parents weren't super religious. I don't think they realized how strict and fundamentalist the school they were sending me to was. So it was like a culture shock. Like we had a library, and I was like interested in learning about dinosaurs. And like in 6th grade, one of my classes was like they asked how old the world was and asked about dinosaurs and all these things, and I just gave all the answers I knew from my elementary school. And then I was like, like made an example of
nice.
like of the secular world, and like how the secular world has these misunderstandings, and the world's obviously only 6,000 years and all this other stuff, which is not the point of. I want to say something nice about your wife. Is that from 6th grade and on, what Deandra always something that she was consistent about, that was just, I think, comes from a really deep place of like love and loyalty, was the kind of person that can see somebody that's like uncomfortable or being treated like a fish out of water, and have a sense of like compassion and empathy and like belonging to them. And that's like, that was 6th and on, like whether or not I was getting like cyberbullied because of a Zanga post I wrote, and she like came to my defense, or literally, real story, and I'm sure Andrew you know this, but and I was like 17, maybe 17 or 18. I was going to youth group, and one of my friends showed up to beat me up at the youth group. Like was waiting in the parking lot so that he could like kick my ass after I got out of the youth group because he believed that I had cheated with his girlfriend, right?
Oh my gosh.
Which I can say decades later, since I have no idea where he is in the world and everything, and there's no consequences. No, I did not. I never did anything with his girlfriend. But he believed it, and it was like terrifying. And I didn't even like hold her hand, kiss her, flirt. Like it was just somebody that I didn't even have like that kind of feeling for. I love that even now, like the 17, 18-year-old me feels defensive. Like I need to explain all the reasons why it was unfair for him to think
That's
that I was
exactly
into
what I was
her.
just thinking.
I've just time traveled back to like, I really did it though. And Deandra was there, and she told him to like get his ass out of there and got him to leave the parking lot before I even really knew what was going on. I was like kind of finding out like after the matter that she like went to bat for me. I'm like, you know, like it's like Charlie's not going to do that and you're being crazy or whatever. Anyway, that's just one of my favorite stories to share about your wife. She helped me not get my, and I probably would have got my ass kicked. That was, you know, I was much more of a pacifist. You know, I was coming out of youth group for God's sakes, so I'm thankful for that. Anyway, any last questions or curiosities or anything from you, Astrid?
No,
Wait, you just
that
asked
was the
that.
one.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You asked it. Andrew, do you have anything?
No, I mean I'm just blown away on the direction of this conversation. Which
right
when Charlie hopped on, I was already on because I was kind of fiddling around, and he had sent me a text message that had the link to your website on it, and I was looking at it. But as I started looking at it, he popped in, so I immediately stopped looking at it and started talking to him. And it goes back to the thing we talked about at the very beginning, which is like, I'm never going to do prep for these ever again, because all of the conversation that would have happened had I just like dove into your website and been like, oh, talk to me about, like, it would have been nothing compared to what we landed on today. So, thank you for being a part of this. Yeah, Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift was not coming up in this podcast, period, had we prepped. So, no, I don't have anything other than that, man. This is just a ton of fun. I'm super excited that the conversation went where it went. And I definitely look forward to having more conversations just like this one.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Astrid. Thanks for being on. This is great.
Yeah, y'all are a joy.